Who seeks recognition, Mr. Barton, on your side?
Mr. Walden.
Oh, let me make an announcement. We've considered amendments to Title I. We've considered amendments to Title II. We've considered amendments to Title III. We're going to open the bill up for amendments to any title. So the bill is open for amendment at any point.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It is, actually, I'll throw you a curveball. It's actually Upton 003, which is unrelated to Upton 007, our secret agent from Michigan.
The point of order has been reserved. The gentleman from Oregon is offering an amendment that has the name of the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, and without objection, that amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this amendment is to build upon the notion that renewables are a good thing, and that renewable energy that doesn't emit any more than those on the list that you'll find on page 21, that doesn't exceed or perhaps even comes in less, should be included. And of course, as technologies develop, there will be new ones that may not be on this list. So this amendment's really pretty simple. It says any source of electric generation with emissions of air pollutants that do not exceed those of the emission source listed in any of the preceding subparagraphs, which has the highest emission levels of air pollutants. So it amends the Clean Air Act and basically says there are some others out there that don't pollute, that should be included. Some new technologies may come along, and they should be treated as renewable energy under this act. And I would yield to my colleague from Michigan for further comment.
Well, thank you. I thank the gentleman for offering this brilliant amendment. I'd note for the record I did vote against cloning, so it is your amendment. You know, we don't want to pick winners and losers. The whole purpose is that we have renewable source of energy, no matter what the cost, and this fits that criteria. And so, whether it be woody biomass, whether it be existing hydro or new hydro, all those different things ought to qualify as a renewable part of the renewable base. And we're going to have another amendment a little bit later on that looks at states that have actually embarked on a renewable portfolio standard. We want those states to keep their rights in terms of what they've done as what they've done to identify their base. But this is a greater universe of what would count as renewable, and I think it's a very good amendment. I yield my time back to the gentleman from Oregon.
And I yield back and ask your support on this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment sounds neutral in the definition of a renewable, but it in effect would allow nuclear to be considered a renewable fuel. We've had this issue before us a number of times during the committee's consideration of this legislation. While nuclear has the enormous advantage of not emitting carbon dioxide, it is not a renewable fuel. It's based on fuel from uranium, which is mined, which is not renewable. It's similar to coal in that sense. And when we defined renewable, the idea of having nuclear as part of the definition was not what was those who support renewables had in mind. It's already a technology that's been available, been in use, plays a very important and valuable role in our portfolio of energy supplies, but if we had nuclear considered a renewable, it would in effect crowd out other renewables that we want to encourage to be developed. That was the reason why in the compromise on the RES that we said that future nuclear power would be not considered in the base for how much would have to be achieved for the renewable objectives. And I think this amendment overturns the compromise, undermines what we're trying to do in the renewable area, discourages the development of new renewables that need attention and need guarantee that they're going to be marketable in order to make more renewable fuels available.
Would the gentleman yield for a brief question?
Yes, I'll be glad to yield, Mr. Upton.
One of the things that other countries do, France, UK, Japan, soon to be China, they are now in the process of recycling spent nuclear fuel, high-level nuclear fuel. Our country, of course, has a ban on that. I'd like to think that at some point down the line we will reverse that. We'll start that in this country. If, in fact, we had that program here, would the gentleman then support this amendment if we could recycle it, knowing that you can do it up to 90%?
Let me not make a decision here, sitting here, without getting all the information. Maybe, maybe not, but I don't want to decide it now.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Since I yielded back early, if I could just make a point, and I appreciate your yielding to me. I think as we look at these renewables, any of us could make an argument that something has to happen to develop them. For example, there's a fairly high intensity of energy that's consumed to create solar panels. We're actually making them in my state. There are things that have to be mined that go into those solar panels. When you look at the wind turbines that are going up in rapid pace in my district, there's a lot of carbon, there's a lot of steel, there's all the electrical components. And so into every source of energy, even renewable, part of how you get it into the transmission line, part of the equipment and the towers and the blades and all of that requires some level of energy. Actually, and interestingly enough, and I haven't mentioned this word yet this morning, but I will, woody biomass is the most renewable probably thing out there because it just keeps growing. And so I hope that at some point we can fix that problem in this bill. This would do that. All this amendment says is as long as you don't emit, we're trying to deal with this carbon issue in the atmosphere is what this bill is trying to achieve. Why don't you work with us to generate new power from sources that don't add to greenhouse gas emissions, like hydro, like biomass, like nuclear, to deal with the atmospheric issues that the IPCC and others have said are so important to deal with. So I hope you'll take another look at this amendment and support it, and I appreciate your courtesy in yielding your time to me on that.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Reclaiming my time. I'd be happy to continue to work with the gentleman, not to continue, to begin to work with the gentleman, because we've been very anxious to do that. But this amendment is not acceptable, and those other decisions that you would like us to look at for the future, I think we need to examine carefully and see if there's a way we can reach agreement.
Mr. Chairman, will you yield?
My time has expired, and I'm going to recognize Mr. Barton, and he can yield to.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and
fit.
I'll yield some of my time to Mr. Gingrey. I don't know if it's good news or bad news, Mr. Chairman, but this was the nice amendment. You know, this is the amendment we're actually put forward thinking that it would be accepted and you would work with us on this. The authors of the legislation are at war with themselves. The stated goal of this legislation is to reduce greenhouse gases that are made by man in the United States. That's a noble goal. If that's truly the goal and the primary goal, this amendment should be accepted because it's politically neutral. It simply says any source of electric generation that has emissions of air pollutants that don't exceed those of the emissions listed in the preceding paragraphs, which have the highest emission levels, would qualify. And you're exactly right. Nuclear power would qualify because it is zero emissions. Hydro would qualify because it has zero emissions. It is possible that clean coal technology at some point in time would qualify. It is possible that several other technologies that we don't even know about would qualify. But what this amendment does is it takes the politics out of the definition of renewable. If your goal is to reduce man-made greenhouse gases in the United States, this amendment should be accepted. If that's not the primary goal, if the primary goal is to pick winners and losers in the emerging alternative technologies, it's a different ball game. I would point out that some of the sources that are listed, some of the solar voltaics and things of that sort, are extremely expensive and very, very unlikely to ever be large baseload sources of energy. On the other hand, hydroelectric power and nuclear power from these new reactor designs could be very much a part of a future clean energy strategy. I would also point out what Mr. Upton did, and that is that if the United States reverses Carter administration policy and decides to reprocess its spent civilian commercial reactor rods, you can recycle, I think, about 98%, is it 90, of the energy that's in those rods, which would diminish the need for a Yucca Mountain or similar type repository. So this is a difficult one to, I would think, to say no to, and I would hope that some members of the majority would say yes and join with the minority to pass it. And I'll yield to Mr. Gingrey.
And I thank the ranking member for yielding, and I certainly do support the amendment. And I think it's important to note that while the chairman says uranium is not renewable, it indeed is ubiquitous. If coal is plentiful in this country, and indeed it is, we probably have 150 years worth of reserves of coal, uranium may be the most abundant element on the periodic table. And it's easily mined. It's here in the United States. We don't have to be dependent on some country that doesn't like us very much. So, and then of course the point was brought up by Mr. Upton that the reprocessing technique that's used in France, where 80% of their power is generated from nuclear, it is so close to being a renewable source that I can't understand why we wouldn't include it. And the other thing, the final point I will make is, with nuclear, you cannot pick winners and losers. You can put a nuclear plant pretty much anywhere. We're going to have 4 in the southeast in my state of Georgia, at Plant Vogel and Plant Hatch. And we're producing 20% of our electricity by nuclear, and we can grow that. So I thank the gentleman for yielding time. I'll yield back to him. But clearly, nuclear is so darn close to being renewable that I think it meets the definition. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For the last 5 minutes of debate on this amendment, I want to recognize Mr. Markey, but before I do, if I might, on that 5 minutes, indicate that we're not arguing whether nuclear should be used. We're not arguing whether coal should be used. We want sources of energy to be used that can be used in a way that protects the environment, and we're able to do that with nuclear now, and we hope to be able to do that with coal at some point, and we're putting a lot of money into achieving that objective. But this is a question that goes to the definition of renewable. Mr. Barton says perhaps the majority is at war with itself. Well, let me indicate the majority is going to win the war, because with ourselves, because what we wanted to do is encourage the use of a wide diversity of fuels: nuclear, coal, natural gas, oil, and renewables, some of which are already available, and much more will be very effective and low cost if we give the encouragement and the market for it to be developed. Mr. Markey, to close the debate.
I thank the Chair very much. As the amendment is drafted, It says that any source of electric generation with emissions of air pollutants that do not exceed those of the emission source listed in any of the preceding paragraphs will essentially qualify. Well, our definition for renewables in the legislation that we're now considering is that 20% of electricity by the year 2020 should come from renewables or efficiency. Since 20% of all electricity in the United States today is generated by nuclear power, that would mean that there would be no new renewables at all, since the entire standard would be met by the existing base of nuclear power in our country. A perfect match. 20% nuclear already in existence, 20% is what we're calling for.
Would the gentleman yield on that point? Brief.
I would be glad to yield.
If this were to pass, we would be willing to accept an amendment to change the standard to 30%, perhaps. Move it up so that you get nuclear and you get your others too.
Well, again, let me continue. Hydropower is another 6% already in existence. As the chairman already pointed out, our goal is not in this legislation to harm nuclear power. In fact, most of the major nuclear energy utilities in the United States have endorsed this bill. And the reason that they have endorsed it is that they know that once there is a cap placed on carbon, that their ability to go to the capital markets to raise money, combined with the loan guarantee programs, which the federal government has already authorized, will increase the revival of the industry, which the gentleman from Georgia has already indicated is occurring at the Vogtle site in his state already. So this is really not a question of whether or not nuclear is going to be a part of the mix in the future. It has been in the past. It will be again. And this bill is going to play a large role in reviving it, regardless of what anyone might think about it as a technology. This legislation, however, is also trying to focus upon biomass, on wind, on solar, on geothermal, on hydrokinetic, and on a whole group of other technologies which historically have been underfunded. The nuclear sector itself over the years has been a favored technology of the federal government, and that is why it is up to 20% of our total electricity mix. That is why there is more electricity generated from nuclear in the United States than there is in the country of France. And it is going to continue to increase. And the gentleman from Georgia is saying that he already is witnessing that down in his home state. So the evisceration of the renewable goals which we have for our country would be complete if this amendment was adopted. I can't urge more strongly that the members reject it. This is part of a very well-balanced plan that we have going forward that includes clean coal, tens of billions of dollars for carbon sequestration for the coal industry. Nuclear has loan guarantee programs and other programs that are included. I urge a no vote so that the renewables can play the same role in the future as these other energy technologies.
All time has been complete. All time has been taken in the debate. We'll now proceed to a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. No. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. No. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton. Ms. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Yeah, I will. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Rush? No. Mr. Rush votes no. Yeah, I see him. Mr. Doyle? No. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Harmon? No. Ms. Harmon votes no. Mr. Ross? Aye. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Mr. Space.
Right. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Yep.
What do you have?
30 for you and 26 for me.
Clerk ready to report the vote?
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 26 and the nays were 29.
26 ayes, 29 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.